Thank you all for being here this morning, and Alissa, take it away.
Awesome. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Alissa Wolfe, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Suzanne Stone. I want to first off thank Suzanne for joining us this morning. For those who don't know, Suzanne Stone has worked on the front lines of wolf restoration in the Western United States since 1988. She started out as a Boise State intern for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA Forest Service, and the Nez Perce Tribe Central Idaho Interagency Wolf Recovery Steering Committee. That one's a large one. But as an intern, Suzanne coordinated reports of wolf sightings around the state and helped document wolves in the wild places of Idaho. After graduation, Suzanne served on the forefront of Central Idaho and Yellowstone's wolf reintroduction in the mid-1990s, in which she cared for wolves awaiting transport from British Columbia and releasing them in Central Idaho. In 1999, she was then recruited by the Defenders of Wildlife as their Idaho-based wolf conservationist. Suzanne completed her master's program in wildlife conflict resolution, and that was at Prescott College. That made her turn her attention towards assisting scientists, ranchers, and wildlife managers in developing and testing non-lethal methods that protect wild livestock from wolf and other native predators. Suzanne is now the executive director of the International Wildlife Coexistence Network, where she works to help protect wolves and other endangered wildlife all around the world. Suzanne is the co-founder of the Wood River Wolf Project in Idaho, and she has won numerous awards for her leadership in wildlife conflict resolution and has been featured in countless articles and interviews. She's also the lead author and researcher on the study entitled Adapted Use of Non-Lethal Strategies for Minimizing Wolf-Sheep Conflict in Idaho, which was published by the Journal of Mammalogy in 2017. And this research was documented through a 7-year case study, which focused on demonstrating non-lethal measures to minimize conflict between wild predators and livestock. Her talk, which we'll hear today, entitled Why All the Conflict Over Wolves, examines the relationship between people and wolves in Idaho from a social, political, and ecological perspective. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Alissa, very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So my understanding is that if you have questions that you'll be able to put those in the chat feature for us. And if it's a burning question, you might want to raise your hand so I can, because I won't be watching that chat too closely, but I'm really happy to answer questions also as we go. Let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen with you. Just want to note that my name is Suzanne, and a lot of people call me Susan or Susie, and I answer to everything, but it's Suzanne. So hold on just a second, and I will pull this up for you. Okay, let's see, where do we share screen? And let's do this here. So I'm going to take you into my presentation right now, and hopefully it's going to come across to optimize from the beginning here. So can you see this okay? The word imagine on your screen? I can't hear you, so I'm...
We can, sorry. Yep, we got it.
Great. Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm just going to start you back at the time when I was an intern working for wolves. This was before we had any known wolves in the state of Idaho. So it was, in the late 1980s, early 90s, before the wolf reintroduction. And my job as an intern was to go out and interview the people around the state who were would be potentially affected stakeholders in the wolf idea of restoring wolves to Idaho. I was also monitoring the wolf population for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that meant going out on the ground, doing howling surveys for wolves, and taking the reports from the public as to wolf sightings around the state, and then investigating those. So I'm going to speed you forward just a little bit. and talk about my first experience with wolves in Idaho, and that was in 1991. I was in the process of doing my summer field work for the Central Idaho Wolf Recovery Steering Committee, and that was monitoring for wolf activity, mapping it out. This was long before we had GPS, so it was a real pain to do the mapping procedures. But the funnest part was going out and actually looking for wolves on the ground. And most of the time that turned out to be a bust. You know, we didn't find anything, you know, occasional track here or there. My most exciting, memorable experience before we found wolves was my first time to go out and do a howling survey. It was my second time to actually howl for wolves out loud with my mentor from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And on my second howl, we had rifle bullets just zing right over the top of our heads. And as we were jumping in the truck and heading back down the road, Dr. Fritz, who was my mentor at the time, looked at me and started laughing. He goes, "I think I taught you how to howl too well." So it was kind of a baptism by fire into the wolf world here in Idaho. But this day is one that was really special, in that I was out in the backcountry up in a place called Bear Valley, and we'd had lots of reports of wolves in this area that come in clusters over the last week. And on a weekend, I had zipped up there and set up camp and did my usual howling, not expecting to hear anything. And as I was setting up my camp, it was kind of late at night, the moon was rising. I just want you to kind of put yourself in that position, being out there in the woods alone. And as the moon is rising up over the horizon, and you know, you've got this wonderful sound of all these crickets and the night birds and all that. I howled, and then half an hour later, I was still waiting. Actually, I'd given up by then. It had been a half an hour since I'd been howling. And all of a sudden, the woods just erupted with this beautiful sound of wolves howling back. The spot I'd been. So they howled and they howled and they howled, and it was just like time stood still. Yeah, I couldn't believe that, you know, an entire pack was howling back to where I was standing, and had been standing half an hour earlier, and I hadn't moved off very far, maybe a couple hundred yards, and then they stopped. And I thought, oh gosh, it can't be just that end of it. So I had gotten my tape recorder out, and you know, was just waiting for them to go again, and they didn't. It was kind of quiet for a few moments, and I thought, what the heck, I'll just howl. And so I howled, and they responded back to me, and then we just went back and forth. And as I would howl and my howl would end, they would come in with their howl and overlap, and it just went back and forth for several minutes. And then at some point I heard a warning bark, which is the bark bark that they used to warn each other. And I thought that they'd gotten my scent, but they didn't get my scent. What I found out a few moments later, because my hearing is nowhere near as good as a wolf's, was that they had heard the truck coming down the road up in this, you know, right on the edge of the wilderness area. And so they were warning each other that there was a truck coming. And that was it. A few weeks later, we found the body of one of the wolves that had been from that pack that had been poisoned intentionally. A cow carcass had been laced with a neurotoxin, and we think that that's what happened to the entire pack. But that was my beginning of wolf management. So we know, you know, history-wise, wolves have had a tough road. I mean, they were one of the most common land mammals in North America at one point. And yeah, especially as far as numbers here in Idaho, we probably had somewhere around 250,000. And then, settlers came in, viewed wolves and other predators as being a threat to livestock, but wolves were particularly vulnerable because they eat as a family, they share everything as a family. So if one wolf was going to get poisoned, it was usually the whole pack would end up being poisoned. And that eradication effort really got started in the late 1800s, and then as the government put a bounty on wolves, it then created a real crash in the population to where by 1930 we really didn't know of many wolves in the West at all, and it was not for decades after that, the wolf reintroduction in the mid 1990s, that wolves across the region. So are you guys still able to see this okay?
Yep.
Great, okay. Sorry, I can't see you, so I'm gonna just have to count on you telling me if there's a problem. So anyway, so this is Molly Beatty. She was the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Bruce Babbitt next to her, Secretary of Interior. And this is the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park was huge news during the mid 1990s. Idaho was kind of a sidebar. We didn't get much publicity on the Idaho issues, but we were also doing a reintroduction into Idaho at the same time. And I served in that reintroduction team, letting some of the first wolves go in Idaho and again, near the Frank Church Wilderness area, just outside of Salmon, Idaho. So it was, through all kinds of political manipulations, court stuff going on, everything around the background. But wolves were one of the first species that were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1973, 74. And, the West was really their home. I mean, their habitat was still here. The prey base was still here. They still filled an important ecological niche that wasn't being filled while they were absent, as we've certainly seen now from all the research in Yellowstone. But what was absent was the wolf. And so when the government went forward with the efforts to restore wolves, that took place over 1995 and 1996. And there was a lot of public input, but when you're opposed to an idea, it's never public input enough. Because you always feel like, for some people, they would feel very cheated because the government didn't make the decision that they wanted to see made. And, here in the region, wolves were still pretty popular. So Boise State did lots of public surveys back at that time, and they noted that about 66% of the people, even in Idaho, wanted to see wolves returned to the state. So it wasn't like it was just the Western states were opposed to this. It was just that it was a very polarized and very heavy conflict between people who love the land. I hope that's not going so fast on yours. Okay, sorry. I only hit it once. So this is Yellowstone National Park, and of course, wolf viewing in Yellowstone is one of the most popular things. We have millions of dollars that are being pumped into the local support base economically for rural communities around the park because of wolves coming back. I mean, it's been a huge success for tourism there. But in Idaho, not so much, right? We don't have a lot of tourist places where you can go to view wolves. We've never taken advantage of that opportunity, though it certainly exists. But we don't have our own little Yellowstone to draw people in. So with Idaho, it was very different. We still gain from the ecological benefits of having wolves in the landscape, but not so much the tourism dollars coming here. So the focus here has been, what changes with wolves being back on the landscape? And this is, folks have grown up here for generations hearing about how terrible wolves are. And if you want to fill a meeting room, just offer a wolf talk in ranching country and you will have every seat filled. It has been driving a lot of the conflict within the rural community. They see the wolf as being a threat to their livelihood, a threat to their way of life, and something that they never really agreed to, and that would never want to agree to if they had a choice. So there's not a lot in it for them to have wolves coming back on the landscape. And so that has provided a lot of resistance to the idea of learning how to live with wolves. But let's talk about putting them in perspective, right? So if you look at the overall cattle inventory and the mortality associated with cattle, and we're going to talk about both cattle and sheep, but if you look at causes of death, of course, losses from health, weather conditions, birthing problems, that's a pretty significant portion of the cattle operations loss. If you go back down, you tease out of that the loss from predators, it's a little bit less than 10% of the loss overall, and most of that is due to coyotes and dogs. If you look back again, and this is reports from the livestock industry, these aren't necessarily confirmed. This is just what cattle operators are reporting back to the government in terms of what they blame for loss. They themselves these are not confirmed losses. And then this is nationally. So wolves were blamed for about 10,000 livestock loss in 2015. That was the year that this data was gathered. So, putting that in perspective, let's look at the cattle by rank. So if you're looking at, breaking that down, the respiratory problems are a huge thing. So that's like pneumonia, right? Unknown diseases, a big deal. Lambing and calving, those are birthing problems are always a big issue, especially the bigger the livestock, the more likely they are to have birthing problems. And we tend to, our industry or the livestock industry tends to breed for larger and larger animals, which causes a lot of problems in that reproduction system. And then, down the list here, and again, this is as reported by the ranchers, so there tends to be more blame associated what we've seen with wolves on these than there is actual evidence for. But taking it, on face value, wolves are ranking down there right above black bears and grizzly bears, and certainly less than dogs, for example, which are about twice as many losses to dogs as there are to wolves. And so we're looking at sheep now, kind of same thing. There's a big sheep industry, the losses from health, maladies and weather. Again, the highest cause with sheep. Coyotes by far are the heaviest predator on sheep, but also dogs rank higher than wolves. Losses from wolves, this is nationally around 1,300. Let's look at Idaho, for example, and in specific, right? So we have 3 million cattle in the state. This is from 2015. It was the last year we could get data from the USDA. And so and again, this is the numbers that the ranchers are estimating. This is not confirmed losses. Nobody went out and investigated to see if this was actually a loss caused by wolves. But even at that more liberal estimate, wolves account for 0.04% of livestock losses here in the region, here in Idaho. And same thing with sheep. With sheep, it's a little bit more in terms of overall percentage. Wolves kill more sheep than they do cattle, and everything kills more sheep than they do cattle, pretty much, because sheep are so vulnerable if they're not really well protected. So that's our sheep inventory, and then the 0.08%. It was the loss rate in 2015. So what do you do about this, right? There's this big perception that wolves are a huge conflict, a huge loss, a threat to livestock in the industry. But, when you get out on the ground, what is actually happening out there? Does it really match up with the what you see in the newspaper, for example? When there's wolf conflicts, it usually makes some kind of media, some kind of press. That's not true of black bears, mountain lions, coyotes, or any of the other predators. It's really only true of wolves. Sometimes grizzly, they might rank up there, but wolves are such a hot button issue that it tends to really come with the press associated. So it's kind of like I explained to reporters that if you only focus on wolves, it's very much like focusing on every time, doing a big publicity campaign every time it rains in Boise. right? So we hit the papers with big news that it's rained in Boise every time it happens. Now, we know we live in a drought area and that we get 12 inches of rain per year, but somebody outside of our area seeing this news come out every time it rains here would think that we lived in a swamp, right? That it just gives that perception that, gosh, it must be a really wet place because there's so much attention being paid to it. And I think that that's been, really what's been driving so much of this. Also, the other issue beyond cattle and sheep issues beyond the livestock are elk and deer. And that's been a big conflict point for people in Idaho as well. So this last year, which they've been doing for 9 years now, the Idaho Fish and Game did aerial gunning. What they do is they go on the ground, they capture wolves, put radio collars on them, let them go back to their pack. And during the winter months, they'll go in and use that wolf, they call it a Judas wolf, use that collar to track the wolf back to its pack and then kill all of the pack members that they can. And they're doing this in the Lolo district of the Clearwater National Forest. This is an area where the peer review scientists have told us that if you killed every single wolf in this area, that it would do nothing to change the number of elk in that area because it is a habitat issue. It's much more than it is a predator issue, and that wolves they can't survive without prey. So if there's not adequate prey, they won't be there. But we have the government, the state has decided that they want a certain number of elk in this area. It's not based on science. It's not based on carrying capacity of the habitat that's there. It's based on how many elk that they want to provide for hunters during the hunting season. And as such, there's that elk population has kind of dropped dramatically as the habitat has changed over the years, and it's changed due to fire suppression in the area. And so, bulls are end up taking the blame for it. But how are the elk doing? That's the question we always point back to. Sorry, that slide's a little bit fuzzy on top there. You can look at the readout though, and our elk population in the state, we're at over 120,000 elk. That's 25,000 elk more than we had when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. And their distribution is a bit different than it was in the 1990s, but certainly the numbers are big. And these are the population objectives. You can see the green ones are where they are within objective. The yellow is where they are above elk objectives, and the blue shaded areas are where they are below. Again, this isn't about carrying capacity or what the habitat can sustain. This is about the Fish and Game Commission setting numbers based on how many elk that they want to provide for hunters in those areas. So how do we solve the conflicts? This has been a question that has been with us for 25 years now. And part of the solution is learning how to protect livestock from wolves and all other species. But how do you do that on such a big, large scale where you have sheep and cattle spread across, the landscape? I've worked with a lot of private landowners, small pastures early on in my career, and those are pretty easy to solve. You can pretty easily protect a pasture and make sure that wolves don't come and prey on livestock in a pasture situation. It's a little different when you're working on a bigger scale where you have sheep moving in bands across the landscape or cattle out on large allotments. We took what was the worst case scenario and just said, okay, wolves kill more sheep than they do any other type of livestock. Let's look at sheep conflict hotspots in Idaho, and let's see, could we use these same methods or similar ones to help protect sheep on these public lands, and what would that look like? And so we did this amazing literature review and found out that there was a lot of people saying that you could not do this, that there was too costly and practical. There's no way that you could be able to offer in any way that it would be effective. But what we found out is that nobody had tried it yet. So we thought, even if we fail, at least let's try it and see what happens. So we established the Wood River Wolf Project in Blaine County, and we are at 13 years now and counting. And that's going to be my next focus here, is not just on the conflicts, but on the solutions and talking about those. So first thing that we did, in 2007, there was a pack of wolves that moved into the Blaine County area. It was called the Phantom Hill Pack. And they were happily raising pups. We had our own little mini Yellowstone going on, where local tourists would come out and residents and set up their spotting scopes and watch these wolves raising their pups at a den site at a place called Phantom Hill, just outside of Ketchum. And, there was just like lots of activity, and people were really excited about having them come back in the area. And then about mid-June, the bunch of semi trucks pulled in, and the trucks unloaded a few thousand sheep. And within 48 hours, we had, I think it was 13 dead sheep and 1 dead livestock guardian dog. Wolves view dogs as strange wolves, and the biggest threat to their pups are strange wolves. So they are automatically very defensive about having anything that resembles a strange wolf coming into their territory. And of course, the sheep went right on top of where they were caring for their pups. And so it was just this massive conflict. Because we were working with a group called Lava Lake Land and Livestock at the time, which was one of the producers in the area, we were able to pull together a team of people that looked at, we're already using these deterrents with one producer here. What if we use them with all 5 of the producers that use this area? And so we came in and started working on establishing this local group. And it included Blaine County, the state of Idaho, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, local activists, certainly the local ranching community, and others. And we decided that we were going to, our goal would be to test and utilize non-lethal methods to try to minimize livestock losses in this area. Could we do this at such a large scale? And that was the goal that we set for ourselves. So we set about doing things like monitoring the wolf population in the area. There were very few radio-collared wolves around, so we needed to find out what were the habits of the wolves that were in the area. Where did they den? Where did they take their young afterwards to go to rendezvous? Where were they in late August, when depredation problems tend to really peak during the summer, late summer months? And we did a lot of stunning. We also, one of the first things in terms of action for the livestock is we took those sheep that were in the Phantom Hill area and we put them behind into a night corral called turbo flattery. Actually, back then it wasn't even electrified, it was just regular flattery. And this came to us as a tool from Eastern Europe, where villagers would set these flags up, and they were basically people's clothing, and they would establish them or set them up on poles and in a huge V shape. And at the end of the V shape, there was a little funnel, and the hunters would wait in the funnel while the villagers came through the woods with pots and pans and scared the wolves into this big trap, essentially. And my graduate advisor, Dr. Musiani from the University of Calgary, looked at this and thought, this could be such a great non-lethal tool. And boy, he was right, because we're using this stuff all over the world now. And it's really the ace up our sleeve. But we spent the rest of the summer keeping the sheep in night corrals. Stuff looks like, it's flimsy, right? Anything could penetrate this. A wolf could hop over it if it really cared to. But what we found is that the wolves don't trust it. They think it's very risky, and they avoid it. And I can share a video with you guys later if you'd like to see, how wolves react to this stuff. It's pretty cool, but it's a great tool. We don't use it all the time because we don't need it. We have other tools that are really effective. But for that summer, when we were right at ground zero with the wolves denning just in the trees back there and raising their pups, this was an essential tool. We didn't have a single other loss of sheep for the rest of that grazing season. We thought we're onto something. We have a lot of other tools now. And so everything from the bright yellow device called Fox lights, which I brought in from Australia about 8 years ago. into North America. It's a fantastic tool. It comes on at dark and it sets a strobe, and the strobe varies. And it looks like, if you see it from a distance, a human walking around the woods with a flashlight. It gives that sense of human presence, which is really what we're trying to do, is give the wolves a sense that humans are there, because we are the riskiest thing to them. And if they think that we're close by, that we're active, that we're paying attention to the livestock, suddenly that risk factor is so high, they tend to just avoid the area and avoid the livestock. We also set up cameras, our field cameras, around documenting the presence of wolves. And as you can see, there's a wolf on its back rolling in what I only presume to be probably sheep poo. And the sheep had been there about 48 hours before then. Wolves interpret their world through their sense of smell. And so this wolf is probably going to take that smell back to the pack and go, guess what? I ran into these strange woolly creatures out in the woods, and here's what they smell like. So it's a way of communicating what's going on in their area. So we did all of these intervention things over the first 7 years of the project, and we set up extra livestock guardian dogs. We set up the turbo flattery. We trained technicians and volunteers to use these methods, and then we also trained the herders on how to use them. What we found after all that time, excuse me, is that we had far fewer losses than any of the sheep operations outside of our operations area. Excuse me, I've been talking too long. So the areas adjacent to us where they were not using those methods had far more sheep losses, 66 as opposed to 9 attacks that we had. We lost 30 sheep over that 7 years period. They lost over 300. And this just kind of shows you how it was going over time as well. This is our 7 years of the project. And even though they're killing entire packs of wolves in this area, what we're calling the unprotected area, the number of sheep losses are still going through the roof, because really the lethal stuff can actually cause more losses than the non-lethal used over time. You can aggravate depredation losses by creating chaos in the system. When you take out wolf packs, new wolves will move in, and if you haven't addressed the risk and protected those animals, then you're going to still have those problems over and over and over again. This is our project area. You can see the state of Idaho is tracking here to see how many sheep losses are in the state. We had 4 that year, as opposed to folks going, in our neighbors. So again, within our average. You see this area in black is the Boise front. That is all written up in our paper, the Journal of Mammalogy. There's a link to that in the class syllabus, so I won't spend any time on it. And I just wanted to talk to you about, what were the things that made this project work. So having herders and field technicians trained in the non-lethal methods is really important. How to apply them consistently is probably the most important, because people sometimes get the stuff and the tools, but they don't know how to use them. And if you don't know how to use them, it's like trying to, operate your car without spark plugs. It just doesn't work. So having someone that knows how to use them properly is essential. Using multiple livestock guardian dogs, but not exposing the wolves to the dogs, or vice versa. Trying to make sure that we keep the livestock guardian dogs away from where wolves are denning in the spring, when they are going to be very defensive of their pups. Knowing where the established packs are. This is, one of the beauties from the non-lethal approach is that we want to maintain packs that are behaving well. And in order to do that, you have to be more proactive about how you're managing the livestock. So it's really important for us in our success to have established packs. Removing dead or dying livestock, and that's super important, because wolves are scavengers as well as predators. They will follow their nose for miles if they think that they can get a free meal off something that's stinky and dead. But if they get there and it's choice between the stinky dead stuff or fresh spring lamb, they'll make the same decision that we would make, and probably go for the lamb. So we want to make sure that there's fewer attractants around the existing livestock while they're grazing. And then monitoring wolves, knowing, in advance, where they're going to go. They're pretty predictable as they use their habitat. So just having an idea of where they set up denning, where they set up rendezvous. It's become much harder to do this in Idaho right now because the state of Idaho just changed its hunting season on wolves this last year. And now there's year-round hunting in most areas. Hunters can go in and kill wolf moms in their dens with their pups, which we lost a pack of wolves this way in our project area this last year. So as a result of the extra pressure on wolves, we've had a much harder time this grazing season protecting livestock than we've ever had before. And then having the right tools in place and knowing how to use them, when to use them, and to change them up. Because if you expose wolves to the same things over and over and over again, they're going to habituate to the and not be afraid of those things. So you want to make sure you keep everything in your toolbox and you change things up enough to keep that sense of risk. Having really good communication is super important as well. And that for us means having people that are versatile in speaking Spanish so that they can communicate with our herders who are from Peru. One of the most important elements of this whole thing is having a community collaboration model so that even the folks that don't agree with each other can at least agree on working together towards solutions. And that's essential to having a long-term sustainable project like this. You're making sure everybody wins, essentially, at that point. That the conservationists are being able to maintain the wolf population and other wildlife, because it's not just wolves that are affected by grazing, it's bears, mountain lions, coyotes, wolverine, everything, right? So, and then on the other side of the agricultural community, making sure that they're getting what they want out of it, which is having a strong, healthy, resilient livestock operation where the sheep or the cattle are well protected. And then funding, of course. And right now, our government spends more money on killing animals than it does on helping ranchers protect against these kinds of depredation problems. They don't spend much in the way of non-lethal. We're seeing that change some, but still we're in that position where that archaic system of if it's a problem, just kill it. And all of the millions of dollars of funding that go into that program are being paid for by you and I, the taxpayers, as part of the federal and state depredation control activities. This is from the former Blaine County Commissioner, and it just sums it up. If we can prevent depredations, then it's the least costly and it's safest, and people get what they want out of it. At the end of the day, everybody's pretty happy. These are project partners. We have a lot of them, and they're growing all the time. And we have a meeting tomorrow with our end of our field season, and to talk to our project partners, people from the community. Talk about what went right this year, what went wrong, how we can better improve for next year. And we really appreciate all that support. This is one of my favorite slides. So just always have to throw that one in there. All right, let me escape from that and come back to you guys. Let's see here. And see if we can't get to some questions.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that wonderful presentation. There have been a number of questions that have come through, and we'll go ahead and, as always, give our students first priority in asking these questions. Just had one early on with some clarifying questions about the Endangered Species Act, and that might umbrella some of the other questions. So, Tess, would you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. So I was wondering, if wolves are on the endangered species list, then why are people allowed to kill them to monitor those elk populations? Because it just seems to me that we would, protect the wolves instead of the non-endangered elks.
Yeah, so wolves lost their federal endangered species protection in 2010, 2011. There was a lot of court litigation over that loss, but they have been under state control since that period. And the state, even though it agreed to manage wolves like they do elk, like they do black bears, mountain lions, everything else, what they've done instead is set up a bounty on wolves that they're helping to fund. and then do one of the most aggressive hunting seasons on wolves anywhere in the United States. So Idaho is kind of turned that corner to go back toward trying to kill as many wolves as possible. And they're certainly working hard at it. They allowed 570 wolves out of a population of somewhere around 1,000. We don't know exactly, but 570 wolves were killed last year in Idaho, and that includes pups. So, and lots that we don't know about. Yeah, it's having that endangered species protection was essential, and wolves around the country still have some protection that way, but it really is not here. It's not present here. The federal government's not overseeing what's happening to wolves in the Northern Rockies. They kind of wash their hands of it.
What year did they lose their protection, did you say again?
2010, I believe, is the court litigation stuff, and it may have gone into effect in May of 2011, but I would have to check those dates.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie's question about keeping track of the statistics on deaths, I think, furthers this sort of conversation we're having about reporting and decision making at the federal level versus at the state level. So Stephanie, did you want to come in here with your question?
Yeah, I was just curious, the statistics earlier on that you presented about the numbers of cattle and sheep death and what those were attributed to, are those solely based on like ranchers reporting, or is there any, I guess, kind of like checks and balances as far as?
Yeah, no, it's only the rancher making an estimate of, going out and trying to either guess or, and what's really interesting is looking at those, they're called the National Agricultural Statistics Service that puts that out, NASS. And what's really interesting and telling to me is that over time, the number of livestock losses hasn't changed very much, but what they're blaming it on has changed dramatically. So if you look at, what ranchers were blaming losses on in Idaho in, 1996 or even 2005, it was still like really heavy on cattle, on coyotes and stuff and disease and all that. But the coyote losses have gone like this, and the wolf, what they're blaming on wolves has gone this way. So it's really interesting to see, and that's just their, it's from their perspective. It's not that we have fewer losses to coyotes out there. We don't. We still have about 50,000 coyotes in the state of Idaho and only about 1,000 or less wolves, right? So, it's perception, of, oh my gosh, something killed it. I don't really know what it is, but I know wolves are a problem. And typically, and that leads to a wolf being checked on the box. So, but it's fascinating to see that it just like ticks up, on wolves and ticks down on coyotes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that process? So I'm a rancher and I lost a cow last week. And what do I do and how is that investigated if the right procedures are followed? How would we determine if my cow died from a predator versus from a disease? Sure.
If they call out Wildlife Services, which is a federal USDA program, there are trained investigators that come out and invest, they'll look at the evidence of what's there. That's even not 100% accurate or reliable because often the investigators end up working for the ranchers in their community. They're affected. The ranchers sit on their hire and fire board. So there's a lot of pressure on those people. And like if they come up with the designation or determination that coyotes are responsible for the loss, there is no compensation for that. But if they say that it's wolf, there is compensation for that. So there's just really kind of perverse incentives going on all the way around that kind of push that pressure onto wolves. I don't think anybody's really investigated it from an academics perspective yet of, looking at that relationship and how it affects the decision making, how it affects the agencies involved. That would be a really fascinating study.
It really is. Yeah. Interesting. So, Alissa, Lola's had a question as well about where if wolves are off the endangered species list, is hunting tags a way of managing their population, and how does that fit into that calculus? Alissa, I'll let you ask the question to make sure we get the heart of what.
Yeah, and Emily, I'm having trouble hearing you. You're really breaking up. So I don't know if that's as you get closer to the mic, it seems like it breaks up more.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah.
Alissa, Melissa, are you there? Could you ask your question?
Yeah, so I was just kind of wondering, it sounds like you kind of answered it though. I was thinking for some reason that like hunters only had a certain amount of tags to hunt wolves, but it sounds like it's just unlimited. Is that okay?
It's unlimited, yeah. And it's almost year round in most of the state, 11 months in portions of the state, and it covers right over the time that wolves are denning. And so in April, late March, April, and early May, wolves are stuck at a den site at that point, and they're extremely vulnerable to being killed by hunters then. So, because I mean, they won't abandon their pups. I mean, this is how they eradicated wolves from our region back in the 1800s, was knowing that if they went into a wolf den, that they could go in and kill the mom, take the pups out. They would wrap the pups in barbed wire, and then as the pups were crying out, then the rest of the pack would come in and try to help rescue them, and they're too afraid of humans to do anything, so the hunter would just pick off the wolves as they came in. I mean, it's that brutal, and it's like, this isn't hunting to me. I grew up in a hunting family. I don't see this as being hunting at all. It's just killing.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah.
Daniel, you had a question about the ballot initiative in Colorado. Could you ask that?
Yes, I know that there's the ballot initiative to reintroduce wolves in Colorado, and at the same time, wolves are finding their own way in. I was just wondering what the pros and cons of a human-based reintroduction are, as opposed to letting them come in on their own. And to piggyback on that, depending on where they would reintroduce them, especially if they go into southern Colorado, would the wolves potentially endanger the burgeoning Mexican wolf reintroduction happening in Arizona and New Mexico?
Sure, good questions. Those are the top questions that are coming out of Colorado, from what I've seen. And I've worked in Colorado quite a bit on wolf issues there. So to answer your first question, the reason that we chose to bring wolves back through reintroduction here in Idaho wasn't because we didn't have occasional wolves coming through. They were dispersing from Canada, from northwestern Montana, and they would occasionally enter into Idaho. When they did, they ended up like my wolf friends that were up in Bear Valley, and that shoot, shovel, shut up mentality just drives it. So those wolves that have shown up in Colorado, there's no known wolves there now. My understanding is that pack is completely the one pack that we've known to come through in the last year and a half, 2 years, that pack is no longer there. And so, one pack is not enough to create a population to anywhere, given a minimum number for building upon, especially, if you look at genetically as well, if they're isolated like that, it's not good for any species to be disconnected from a larger population. So by bringing in wolves, you have the ability to do what we did, which is to select from wolves from multiple different packs from across different regions that then are genetically more healthy. And hopefully that's what they'll choose to do if they go forward with their reintroduction into Colorado. It pretty much guarantees that the wolf recovery will be successful, whereas wolves have been trying to come back into Colorado and getting killed there for decades now. And so the second question was about the Mexican wolf recovery area. My understanding is that they're going to focus the wolf population up in the northern portion of Colorado, with the eye that they would want to keep some protection for the Mexican wolf population, which is struggling. It's one of the most endangered wolf populations in the world. And yet, those populations naturally occurred next side by side with each other. They overlapped, for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, right? So, nature will work that out. But, I think there's going to be, better protection for the Mexican wolves would be great, because that population has been struggling now for decades. And every time a wolf gets into trouble, it just seems like the government's response is to go in and kill the wolf. And that needs to change. We need to see better non-lethal proactive prevention methods on the ground that keep those wolves out of livestock. and do a better job at animal husbandry of the livestock themselves, so that that wolf population can recover. But right now, it's been, you know, it's really not in a recovery mode. It's in a survival at the minimal rate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. You answered those yeah, great.
Thanks, Daniel.
Saleh has a great follow-up on this, where I'm not sure if you can ask it for us, Saleh, but wondering about the reasons for bringing back wolves in general. Are you still there, Saleh?
Yes, I just wanted to, like, the over biggest reason for bringing them back and protecting. Is it simply tourism or their impact on their ecosystem?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, I guess it really depends on who you're asking. So I was an intern for the Nez Perce tribe during my internship during my college years, and to the Nez Perce tribe, I was told by the leaders that, you know, bringing back wolves was a way of bringing back their own culture, bringing back their connection to the land. And so they would answer that question really differently than, say, a biologist who would say, oh, well, wolves are an incredibly important part of the ecosystem because of the niche that they fill, and that is not filled by any other species. And being able to cull elk and deer populations, get disease out of the herds, and keep them from overgrazing areas that otherwise would be habitat for beaver, for songbirds, for other species, and to build that biodiversity, with, you know, strengthen the biodiversity within our system. So wolves are an incredibly important ecological engineer, right? Ranchers, I've had very few ranchers tell me that they thought there was a good reason for bringing wolves back. So, you know, it just isn't, yeah, there's not much in it for them. There's some that have accepted wolves and that are actually working really hard to make their operations more resilient. And to me, they're the way forward, because it's not that they're ever going to be wolf huggers. I don't mean to even imply that, but how they're managing their livestock emulates nature in a way that we don't really see happen very often within the livestock management. They move their herds the way that the old bison herds would move. They do clusters of cattle rather than having individual animals spread out across the landscape. And they rest those big pastures or allotments for big portions of the year, and then they hit it hard again. And what we're seeing is that there is now ecological biodiversity occurring at the soil level that is responding to using the land in a way that nature really meant it to be used. And that is bringing back native plant species. It's bringing back native bird species. It is resulting in forage, the grasses that are 3 times more nutritional than they were when before wolves were on the landscape, before they started using these practices. And it makes the cattle much more resilient to protecting each other, so they actually herd up, and they really don't lose. Very seldom do they have losses to wolves. They're also in grizzly country, so that's, you know, it's harder to protect livestock around grizzly, but it's still, they're having far fewer losses than what their neighbors are that are not using these practices.
Great question, Sally. Thank you for asking that for us, and thank you for the response. I think we'll go first to Nick, who had some questions about how you shift public opinion, and then we'll get into Eli and some other questions about some of the practicalities and the logistics of the non-lethal approach. So Nick, can you frame your question for us, please? Did we lose Nick? I think we did. But it was a good question. How would you suggest shifting public opinion in Idaho around wolves? Was the essence of the question.
It's actually shifting it back right now, because we've had so many decades now of wolves becoming the scapegoat for everything, you know, and it's unchecked. So like, oh gosh, I'm going to say it's been 5 or 10 years ago, there was a case where wolves were blamed for killing a cow near Eagle, Idaho. I mean, this is like more residential type area close to Boise. It made the local news. All of the television stations were excited about it. And of course the Statesman covered it, which it's like, so we went out there, and I went out with one of the top forensic specialists in the world on wolves. His name's Carter Niemeyer. He happens to live in Boise. He used to be head of the Fish and Wildlife Services program for wolves across the region here. And we went out and looked at, got permission from the rancher, went out and looked at this cow that was supposedly killed by wolves. There was not a wolf track around it. There was not a bite mark on this cow. There was definitely an injury. It looked like it gotten hit by a car. It had a big slice across the front of it, and it was right next to a road. It also had a calf in the birth canal that was about halfway past. And so I don't know if the cow had been birthing on the road. We couldn't figure that out, and then it had been struck by the car. But there was nothing tying this to wolves to this at all. But wolves got the blame for it. And so as that continues to happen over and over and over again, it's like the rain in Boise, right? People just assume then that wolves are this terrible threat to livestock. And I think we're having to rebuild that now and sometimes pushing back with facts doesn't really convince people. So what we've decided to do is focus on the positive part of being proactive in how we manage livestock, showing success, that we have far fewer livestock losses in areas where wolves are being protected, or where livestock are being protected from wolves through these non-lethal methods, and then being able to show that that this costs less money overall. We're spending less money to do it. We have far better success rate. The livestock are far more resilient, and the wolf population is not affected. So they're able to live their lives naturally, and it's a win for everybody involved. So why wouldn't we do this? It saves us money as taxpayers. It saves the ranchers livestock losses that they would otherwise have. Even if they're killing wolves, they're still going to have a lot of livestock losses. We've seen that from decades now of looking at what happens after wolves are killed in certain areas to protect livestock. And if they don't address those problems, then the next year they're killing more wolves, and then they're killing more. And it's just this vicious, endless cycle. It just makes so much more sense to just step back and go, wait a minute, we have a better system. Let's put that system into place. It saves us all the cost of this program that's not sustainable. We don't need to pay for helicopters. We don't need to pay for having people out there with sharpshooters. And I mean, it just doesn't make sense to do it this way. We're fighting nature rather than working with her. So teaching people how to work with nature, and it just seems like a much more sustainable long-term solution. That's what we're trying.
So I had a question that I'm interested in, I'm not sure if others are, in terms of the non-lethal methods and whether or not you've used llamas for protection within that, and if that's sort of come and gone. And then we'll go to Eli, who had some technical questions about the night corrals.
Sure. Llamas are wolf candy, and so they're not good protection for wolves. They somewhat good protection when it comes to like domestic dogs, which can be a probably usually your highest risk if you're in a neighborhood or a small rural community where there's lots and lots of little farms. Putting llamas in is just a fine idea then, because they are protective. Burros also work pretty well. They're actually more effective than llamas are with wolves, but they go a little bit ballistic when it comes. They look like the old cartoons of the Tasmanian devils. Just they go crazy when they see a strange canine, and they're very intimidating. And with wolves, big part of it is just trying to assess risk, and if something looks risky, they don't want to go there. They're very risk averse, and so burros have done well, but yeah, llamas not so much.
Fascinating. Thank you. Eli.
Yeah, hi. So with deterring like birds and stuff away from crops, I've noticed that when you use decoys or various different things, they become accustomed to it after time, and they end up returning and paying no mind to it. So I was wondering, with like the nighttime corralling, you're saying that the wolves find it as a risk, so they don't want to enter. And if you've ever noticed that after a certain amount of time, they become more and more accustomed to that structure.
Sure. Well, that's a big part of what we've learned and what we've tried to explain through our paper is that you have to change the deterrents that you're using. You can't use the same thing over and over again and expect that any predator will not eventually habituate to it. So we haven't used a turbofladry night corral in our project area for at least the last 5 years. We haven't needed to. We have so many other deterrents that we're using, like the fox lights, the additional livestock guardian dogs. We have the air horns, which are really great. We have high beam flashlights. We know, just even moving the sheep into places where they're a little bit more secure and away from where we know that wolves are denning or where they're at rendezvous. So we have the ability to kind of move around them as well. We can use them if we need them. They're kind of our ace up our sleeve, but you always want to make sure that you're changing your deterrents. I've even used, you guys are going to laugh, but maybe not so much. We just saw a paper come out of Australia where they're using the same thing in the field, but I've used even the air dancers, the things that are the used car part, they have the big guys that are flapping around and stuff. Now, there's not many places where we can use that it'll be an effective tool, but the places I have used it, wolves have never been back. I mean, they came over the top of a ridge, looked down into the little area below where the farm was, saw this thing flapping around like a wild man. It's 18 feet tall. And those wolves turned around and they have never been back. So, you want to just give the sense that humans are about, that there's higher risk here. And then you also want to be working on the other end of things to make sure that the livestock are healthy. So if you have a bunch of dead livestock around, especially if you've got a pile of them somewhere, if you're in wolf country, you expect to have wolves show up. And if they show up, you're drawing them into where your livestock are, which jeopardizes the livestock. So cleaning up those carcasses, making sure that your livestock, you don't have dying, unhealthy animals around, that also attracts predators, and not just wolves, but coyotes, bears, everything. And so, just having a clean, healthy livestock operation is going to help to begin with. And then beyond that, just getting that sense of risk out there for the predators so that you have good protection going and that it's consistently used in the right way. Yeah.
There was a great paper a few months ago where they painted eyes on the back of cattle, right? And so it looked like the eyes were on their back, and that it decreased that predation by lions, tremendously. So they're really creative.
That started like 30 years ago in India. So I don't know that many people were, looking that far back, but they were using that method 30 years ago to protect livestock from tigers in India. And it's a brilliant idea. But again, if that's all you're using, then you're probably going to, at some point, the predators are going to figure it out. And so you need to be able to change that up too. We're looking at right now, testing next year, an ear tag that if, on the livestock, that if the livestock starts running, that it sets off lights. And the same thing on the livestock guardian dogs. So if the dogs start running and barking, the lights go off, and that becomes, I think that's going to be a great tool to have too. I love all these new tools. I mean, as technology is going, this whole field is growing into its own industry, and we're seeing it happen around the world now, where all these non-lethal tools, whether they're the old methods of the livestock guardian dogs and the shepherding and all that, are now converging with new technologies and drones and AI cameras and all kinds of exciting developments. So it's an emerging field that is really exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry, my microphone is bad. What other questions do you have?
I have one. I lived in a really small town in Idaho where there's still a lot of people arguing that the wolves that are reintroduced are different than the wolves that historically roamed Idaho. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that. I'm curious where that argument comes from.
Misinformation, and the thing that is really interesting about it is just because we brought the wolves from Canada and then they were called Canadian wolves, people don't realize that Canada and the US are concepts that have only been around for a few hundred years, that wolves have been around far longer than that. And our wolves here in Idaho have walked on their own to the places where we took wolves from Canada and then walked back again, within months. So there was never any wall between Idaho and Canada that would have kept, wolves on one side or the other, not crossing back and forth and interbreeding and all that. So it's, and also years ago, decades ago, there was a paper that came out where the scientists were looking at things like they would have examples of like 5 different skulls that they pulled from Utah, and they created a classification for that wolf that had its own name, and then they just broke it down into these tiny little sections of potential populations of wolves that have very, very small differences between them. Their physical characteristics, right? But they were excited about it, because it's like, oh, but there's, you can see some kind of evolution going on. Like the wolves in Utah were so much bigger than the wolves that they found in Idaho, for example, because they were bison hunters. So you have to be a bit bigger if you're going to be hunting bison, right? So those are the wolves that did the best in that area. But the whole thing about the Canadian wolves is really, truly not based on any type of science. It's just science fiction, and it's unfortunate, but it's so deeply embedded because people have heard it so many times that they assume that it's true, and it's not. We took wolves from an area where they could have just as easily walked into central Idaho on their own. They're a very wide-ranging species, so yeah, it's still the same wolf. So yeah, good question though. Thanks, Erin. And Carl, I just want to say I love your background. It's been nice seeing that. So
thank you. Kind of represent.
Yeah. Well, if there's
we
any more
probably have
questions,
room for 1 or 2 more questions.
I'll go. So I've been reading a lot about rewilding, especially in the UK, mainly Scotland. Do you think it's possible for rewilding to work in some of those areas, especially since wolves have been gone for 1,000+ years?
Yeah, I've been, my husband's from the UK, and so we've spent a lot of time in England, Wales. I haven't been in Scotland yet, but I know that there's an awful lot of livestock and at least south of Scotland, very few wild prey left that would be available for wolves. So I would look at it from the prey base. Is it sustainable? And then how do you prevent wolves then from leaving areas where you do have sustainable prey to moving into areas where there is no wall, right? To go back into places like Wales and England. And I think that they would just have to have a really good plan in place. Otherwise, there's probably more sheep in England than there are people. It's a pretty heavily agriculturally dominated landscape and now. So I'd question, the habitat aspects of that. But it's certainly doable on a physical level. But it's not like Colorado where you have the greatest population of elk anywhere in the United States. Colorado itself could sustain more wolves in that one state based on habitat than what we can sustain in the entire Northern Rockies combined. It's that good of a place for wolves. So I would look at, what's the available habitat. But the rewilding concept itself is fantastic. And I think that's the greatest hope really for wildlife around the world is we're seeing populations of species that are just disappearing from the landscape. And if we don't find a way to live with them, they will be gone. Your kids, your grandkids will never know what it was like to have tigers in the wild, or the hippopotamus, the rhino. These will be things that they see in movies and not in the wild. And we have an opportunity right now to change that. And the only way to do that is to find a way to live with wildlife and to work with nature rather than continue working against her. And that's my hope. That's what we're working on.
So as a last, go ahead, Mackenzie.
I just said saying thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for inviting me today. This is a treat. haven't had too many classrooms to do since we've all got through this lockdown stuff. And so it's really, even on Zoom, it's just lovely to be able to see people and to be able to communicate. And happy to answer any questions that come up as you guys go forward with your careers. And if you're interested in the career of coexistence with wildlife, there are plenty of opportunities coming forward that I think are going to be interesting. And I'm hoping that we are going to change the paradigm here of this archaic wildlife control to living with wildlife in a way that sustains both people and wildlife, wild places. And I know we could do it.
Thank you so much. That was the last question I was going to ask, was where should students go if they're looking to get interested in or to get more information. But thank you for providing that. And thank you so much for all of this information today. I teach a class, Animals in History, and we use excerpts from the John Coleman book, Vicious, right? And your talk very nicely paralleled some of those shifts that we can see happening, certainly within our lifetime. So thank you for all of your work on this, and thank you for a very illuminating, enlightening talk for us all. We'll stay on for a few minutes if people have follow-up questions. Otherwise, we will see most of you back here on Friday. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Emily. That was great.
You're so welcome. I wanted to mention too, I'm glad you brought up the Nez Perce, because Jamie Pinkman is going to talk with us in December, and he saw your name on the syllabus and got very excited. So you must.
Jamie's fantastic, and the Nez Perce, we owe such a debt of gratitude to them, because when the state of Idaho decided that they weren't going to have anything to do with managing wolves other than just killing them, the Nez Perce came forward and said, "Okay, well then we will." And so they were the lead wolf conservation team around the state, monitoring the wolf population after the reintroduction, and that they were all part of that. It was wonderful to be able to work with them and to see what it meant to have wolves back on the landscape to them personally.
Well, he's going to talk mostly about salmon, but he mentioned that the Nez Perce went around the state in order to make that happen. So yeah,
they did. Wonderful. They were essential. Yeah, they did a great job. And if you have any students that decide that this is something they really want to follow up, on, there are lots of opportunities out there internationally as well as nationally here. Colorado State has just put together a new graduate program in it's predator, I think, focused, but predator coexistence work. And there's tons of opportunities coming though. And the Senate appropriations this last 2 years now, has pumped a couple $1 million into the system through Wildlife Services to change from the lethal control specialists to non-lethal control specialists out on the landscape. And that shift that's so important and so encouraging, because they are the ones that have been, killing most of the wildlife related where there's conflicts, but they're shifting now from lethal to non-lethal. And I'm really happy to see that happen in my lifetime. Anyway, thank you guys. You take care. Have a great week.
Thanks. You too.
See ya.
We'll be in touch. Thanks so much.
Yeah.